Do you picture cowboys pushing open saloon doors just for a shot of whiskey? In reality, a lot of folks walked in with their eyes on the plate. Those dusty counters served unlikely feasts, cheaper cuts of meat, casserole breads, pancakes that had ridden along in the saddle. They were rustic combinations, meant to fill your belly before the next gunfight. Come along and check out 25 cowboy recipes almost nobody knows actually existed. 1. Son of a gun stew. At first glance, son of a gun stew sounded more like a bar story than real food, but as soon as the cook lifted the lid off the pot, everyone in the saloon went quiet. Into that thick broth went tripe, heart, liver, intestines, marrow bones, feet, and, when there was some, even brain, all surrounded by potatoes, onions, and whatever the land happened to offer that season. It was the official dish of long cattle drives born out of necessity and lack of options. Facing down a steaming bowl was almost like a courage test. Some cowboys bragged less about how fast they drew their gun and more about how they scraped the bottom of the bowl without making a face. In the end, the magic of son of a gun stew was in its simple math. It cost little, warmed up tired bodies, and reminded everyone that far from the city, every part of the cow had its place on the trail. And anyone passing through Dodge City or Abilene knew that if they followed the smell coming from the kitchen, they'd end up sitting in front of this unlikely mix, trying to figure out if they had the stomach for life on the road. 2. Sourdough flapjacks. Before granola bars or fast food combos existed, what kept cowboys moving down the trail were sourdough flapjacks, wide discs of batter sizzling on a griddle in the middle of nowhere. The trick wasn't in the flour, but in the live starter they carried in tins tied to the saddle, like they were hauling gold. All they had to do was add water, a little salt, and the mix came to life, turning into a thick batter thrown straight into bacon grease until it formed a firm crust on the outside and a moist center with a tang that told you how many days they'd been away from home. In the saloons, the same discs came out heavy and stretchy, covered in molasses, pork fat, or preserved fruit when the train brought something new. They could hit the table at sunrise during a shift break or when someone stumbled in after days in the saddle. No wonder they earned the nickname sinkers. They went down like a rock, but they held the stomach of anyone who still had a lot of miles, dust, and danger ahead. They were less of a treat and more of an insurance policy that your body would make it the rest of the way. 3. Fried salt pork with beans. When people talk about the Old West, the first image that pops up is usually gunfights and noisy saloons. But before any cards hit the table or bets landed on the bar, a lot of days started with a deep bowl of beans topped with strips of salty pork. In boarding houses and dusty bars beyond the Mississippi, this was breakfast for cowboys, coach drivers, and travelers who spent entire days in the saddle. The meat, cured in heavy brine barrels, arrived as tough as a board. The cook cut it into thick chunks, let it sizzle on the griddle until it released its fat and formed a crust, then dumped it all over the beans, bubbling away over low heat. When the pantry helped, in went chopped onion, a drizzle of molasses, and another spoonful of lard. When it didn't, beans and broth were enough. Alongside a piece of cornbread or day-old sourdough, this dish held your stomach until the next stop. It was simple, cheap, and easy to make even in cramped trail kitchens, which is why it spread from ranch to ranch. 4. Chuck wagon coffee. In the dust of the Old West, that smoke curling up from the chuck wagon wasn't just coffee. It was the outfit's fuel. Cowboys called the mix six-shooter brew and swore it was strong enough to float a horseshoe or resurrect anyone who'd spent the night playing poker. In dented tin pots, the cook dumped coarse grounds straight into boiling water, and to make it all settle, anything went. Eggshells, a whole egg, a pinch of salt, or even a piece of leather forgotten on the saddle. In the saloons, a blackened pot sat on the stove all day, always topped off, almost never washed. All it took was sliding a coin or a pinch of gold dust across the counter to get a tin mug of that dark liquid, good for chasing off sleep, fueling crooked conversation, and easing a stubborn hangover. Around the campfire, the smell kept time with the stories, quiet laughs, and plans for the next stretch of trail, while someone stirred the pot already thinking about the next round still to come. 5. Prairie oysters, Rocky Mountain oysters. In the dusty saloons of the West, not every famous dish came from the kitchen. Sometimes it came straight from the corral, tied to the memory of freshly branded cattle. Prairie oysters, or Rocky Mountain oysters. The name sounds like something from the sea, but what hit the frying pan were bull testicles taken during castration when nothing went to waste. The hands cleaned them, sliced them into rounds, dredged them in flour mixed with pepper and herbs, and dropped them into hot oil until they crackled. On the outside, a firm crust. Inside, a soft center that many tasted with a bit of hesitation. In states like Colorado, Wyoming, and Texas, the bars waited for branding days to load up metal trays and send them to the counter next to beer mugs and rye shots. Anyone who tackled the first bite drew laughs, backslaps, and, most of all, respect. Anyone who backed out became the butt of jokes, while the piano kept playing and life on the frontier rolled on. It was less about flavor and more about proving you belonged in that world of dust and cattle. 6. Rabbit stew. In the Old West, when cattle didn't make it in or cost too much, cowboys learned to look at the land with different eyes. Any movement in the grass could turn into supper, and no animal was more common than the rabbit, quick, quiet, and spread across the plains. That's where the rabbit stew that traveled through chuck wagons and saloons came from. Hunt the animal, clean it, brown the pieces in pork fat or tallow, and toss everything into a pot with potatoes, onions, carrots, and whatever else showed up along the way, from turnips to mystery roots. Then, low heat and patience until the meat started to fall off the bone and the smell took over camp. In New Mexico and Arizona, that same stew got chilies, cumin, and garlic, a mix brought in by Mexican and native cooks who lived the cowboy life too. For someone coming off days in the saddle, chewing hard biscuits and choking down watery beans, that thick stew was a reminder that even far from home there was still a place to sit, share stories, and get your strength back before moving on. 7. Squirrel fricassee. In the Old West, this dish wasn't some quirky novelty. It was survival. When beef felt like rich folks' food and every cent counted, the squirrels racing through the trees became a sure resource, from Missouri to Arkansas. Hunters brought in whatever they could, saloon cooks cleaned the meat, seared it in a pan, and mixed fat, flour, milk, and pepper until it turned into a thick gravy. Served over biscuits or cornbread, it filled the bellies of miners, loggers, and travelers. It never made it to the sign over the door. It was ordered in a low voice at the bar, a code among people who knew how to pull dinner out of the woods and turn it into a steaming plate on the table. In that routine, the saloon turned into a community kitchen. One guy showed up with 2 squirrels, another with a sack of flour, another with firewood, and everyone walked out with a full plate. 8. Corn Dodger biscuits. In the days of big cattle drives, before cans of baking powder ever arrived out west, there was one ingredient that almost never failed to show up in a saddlebag: cornmeal. Out of it came corn dodgers, compact little cakes molded in the palm of the hand, made from cornmeal, boiling water, salt, and, on good days, a bit of pork or bacon fat. They went into a cast-iron skillet, onto hot stones by the campfire, or into a rough camp oven. In the saloons, they got a spoonful of molasses on top and showed up next to steaming beans and thick stews. Firm and slightly smoky, they lasted days tucked into a saddlebag, wrapped in cloth, waiting for the heat of the next morning to be reborn in a cowboy's calloused hand. A quiet reminder that the trail kept going and the horizon was calling for one more night under the stars. 9. Pickled eggs. Picture pushing open a saloon door and coming face to face with a big jar on the counter full of pale eggs floating in cloudy brine. That wasn't decoration. It was cheap fuel for people living on the road who didn't have money for a fancy meal. The owner boiled dozens of eggs and dropped them into vinegar, salt, mustard seeds, pepper, garlic, and sometimes beets or hot chilies that dyed everything and gave it a strong smell. After a few days, they turned into sharp, punchy protein bombs ready to be devoured in one quick bite. The usual move was to grab one, crack it right there at the bar, and wash it down with a gulp of beer or whiskey, the lightning combo for anyone who needed to get back out into the dust. In 1870, lost somewhere along the trail, that jar was the fast food cowboys really trusted. 10. Hardtack. Before it got any hint of smoky flavor, hardtack was just a dry block of flour, water, and salt, so hard it seemed more like a tool than food. In the saddle, it worked just to keep the stomach from growling. In the saloon, it turned into something else. First, it went into a bowl of water or broth to soften up a bit. Then, it hit the frying pan, where it was covered with a thick gravy made from pork fat, flour, and pepper, sometimes with onions or bits of bacon. When that dish hit the table, steaming, the cowboy who'd spent days gnawing dry crumbs in the dust finally found something rare: a hot, heavy break that was soft on the teeth. Proof that in the West, survival was cooked up on pure improvisation. And as soon as the pan started to sizzle in the back of the saloon, everyone knew that trail food was being upgraded, for a few minutes at least, into a kind of truce in the long march. 11. Buffalo roast. Long before cattle took over the big western ranches, the real rulers of the plains were buffalo. Herds moved like a living carpet, and in the towns clinging to the railroads, every saloon fought to be known for the best buffalo roast. The dark, firm, almost lean meat tasted like wild game and needed time to cook. Open grills or iron ovens, slow heat working away while the cook basted it with the animal's own fat, a handful of salt, and whatever herbs were on hand. The hump was the real treasure. Tender and juicy, it came off the knife in thin slices, sank into a thick gravy, and hit the plate next to steaming potatoes. In mining towns in the middle of the gold rush, a buffalo roast could cost more than a famous steak. It wasn't because buffalo were rare, but because the dish became a symbol of victory. It only showed up in saloons that were making good money, chosen by cowboys and hunters to celebrate a night when everything had gone right. 12. Biscuits with molasses. After a full day in the saddle, dust in their faces, and hardly any food in their bellies, a lot of cattle hands found comfort in a simple dish: biscuits with molasses. The camp cook mixed flour, lard, salt, and a splash of water or sour milk, cut the dough in a hurry, and shoved everything into a cast-iron oven or straight into a smoking hot pan. In no time, the smell spread through the ranch or saloon. At serving time, thick molasses fell in dark ribbons over the crisp crust, running down into the soft center. It wasn't luxury, it was cheap energy before another night on watch or another day chasing the herd. When there weren't fruits and sugar for pies, those same biscuits became a makeshift dessert. And for many cowboys from the South, that heavy cane flavor brought back the stove at home, family on the porch, and a time when the world felt much smaller. Between sips of weak coffee, the dish turned into a quiet reminder of why they kept going. 13. Fried calf brains. In the Old West, nothing from the cow went in the trash, and even the brain ended up as a meal. In a lot of saloons full of broke travelers, calf brains were cleaned, sliced, breaded, and dropped into hot oil until they crackled. They hit the table next to mustard, onions, or hot sauce, and, in towns with German, French, or Mexican influence, were treated like a delicacy. The first bite was surprising: a firm crust, a soft center, like an egg with a richer flavor. For cowboys used to poverty, it was just everyday food, often served with eggs and bread, a frontier breakfast that used every part of the animal without wasting a thing. Today, that combo might sound strange, but back then it was simply a practical way to fill the plate and move on. 14. Game jerky. In an Old West saloon, game jerky wasn't just road food. It marked the end of each hunt. When the men came down from the mountains, they'd tie up the horse, set the rifle aside, and hand the bartender strips of dried venison, elk, or antelope. By then, the meat was already cured in salt, smoke, and sun, sometimes seasoned with chili, pepper, or strong local herbs. It was tough, took real chewing, and kept you going for hours. It didn't need a fire, didn't spoil easily, and paired perfectly with a shot of rye whiskey or a mug of beer. At the bar, some saloons would set out simple plates of jerky strips, pickles, and cheese, ready to go with another round. The rest went back into saddlebags, wrapped in cloth, as trail rations and a solid reminder of the work it took to live off your own hunt. 15. Miner's pot pie. In towns where the mine and the saloon shared the same street, the kitchen was almost an advanced survival outpost. Too many people, not much money, zero fancy touches. Miner's pot pie was born in that world. A deep dish loaded with beef, rabbit, or whatever game showed up, cooked with onions and root vegetables until it fell apart, then topped with a simple crust when there was flour to spare. Some cooks didn't even bother lining the bottom. They just dropped a biscuit-style lid on top and called it good. Those pans crowded into community ovens behind the bar or next to the forge and came out in big chunks, served in tin dishes with pickles or yesterday's beans. For miners and regular cowboys, this was one of those rare moments when a meal felt more like home than like danger waiting outside the door. 16. Cornmeal mush with tallow drizzle. Long before anyone started talking about grits as a trend, it was this cornmeal mush that kept the brutal frontier routine going. In dusty saloons, cowboys and railroad workers leaned against the bar and ordered a dish that filled the belly without draining the wages. The cornmeal cooked slowly in water or milk until it thickened, then went into tins, set into firm blocks, got sliced thick, and went back onto the griddle to pick up a crisp crust. Some folks poured molasses or sorghum syrup on top. Others went salty with melted beef tallow, salt, and pepper. There was no charm or luxury to it, just enough heat and heft to take the edge off homesickness, while the world outside stayed rough. Between sips of coffee and the sound of boots on the floorboards, every bite reminded them that out there, eating well just meant eating enough to keep moving. 17. Wild turkey and dumplings. Back when keeping cattle in pasture was rich rancher luxury and bison almost never broke the horizon anymore, a lot of isolated saloons relied on whatever the rifle could bring in: deer, duck, hare. But nothing shut down the chatter like a pot of wild turkey and dumplings on the wood stove. The wild turkey went into the pot whole until it finally gave in. Then it was shredded and dropped back into the broth, rich with onions, garlic, pepper, and herbs. When the dumpling dough hit the pot in big spoonfuls and began to puff up, the smell took over the room and made cowboys walk away from good hands of cards, sure that this meal was worth more than any round at the table. In minutes, the piano went quiet, the chips stopped clacking, and even the bartender leaned on the counter just to breathe in the steam. Anyone who tasted it swore that for a moment the saloon stopped being a frontier outpost and turned into a crowded family kitchen. 18. Dried apple pie. In the Old West, fresh fruit almost never showed up, but bags of dried apples crossed deserts like treasure. In the saloon, they went straight into a pot with water, slowly plumping up before getting cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar, turning into a thick filling that scented the whole room. The crust, made only of flour, lard, and water, was rolled out thick and sturdy, built to handle cast-iron heat and to be cut into slices tough enough to survive days on the road. Some pies got a top crust, others stayed open, depending on how much dough there was that day. When someone stuck a fork in the middle and the first cloud of steam rose, the mix of sweet and tart, with a light smoky note, brought back memories of faraway orchards, and, for a few seconds, was worth more to any dust-worn cowboy than a shot of whiskey. 19. Fried corn cakes. On the frontier, few gestures said as much as throwing Johnny cakes on the griddle. They were little cornmeal cakes made with hot water and salt, a legacy of native peoples that became daily fuel for settlers, cowboys, and saloon cooks. The batter spread out thin, browned slowly until the edges loosened, and hit the table like bread, alongside thick beans and steaming stews. Sometimes they came with molasses or sorghum, but most of the time they arrived plain, firm enough to handle long trails and crowded bars. On cold nights, the smell of cornmeal toasting blended with the jingle of spurs, a sign that real food was within arm's reach. In saloons, they were the quick order for anyone who didn't want to miss the conversation or the card game. Among cowhands and travelers, there was one simple rule. Finding a cook who made good Johnny cakes was reason enough to follow that kitchen's trail for as long as it took. 20. Beef tongue with dark gravy. Today, the idea of eating beef tongue might get you a funny look, but in Old West saloons it was first-class treatment. The cut was chosen because it could handle hours of slow simmering while the room filled with smoke, loud talk, and the smell of fat crackling. The whole tongue went into a pot with onions and spices and cooked until it was tender. Then it was peeled, sliced, and tossed into a blazing hot pan. There it picked up color and got covered in a dark gravy made from pan drippings, flour, and broth, thick enough to coat every slice. It hit the table surrounded by potatoes, cornbread, or fried apples, a heavy plate for a long night. The texture was tender without falling apart, the flavor straightforward, pure meat. It wasn't quick trail food. It was a reward for anyone planning to stay late, burning through chips, a few coins, and a few more stories. 21. Pinto bean chili without tomatoes. Long before canned tomatoes and little spice packets showed up, pinto bean chili was born rough and straight off the frontier. Brown beans, sun-dried chilies, chunks of meat, and nothing else. In Texas, saloons, the red didn't come from sauce, but from ancho and pasilla chilies pounded in a mortar. The meat browned in tallow, the beans soaked overnight, and the pot sat on the fire for hours until it turned into a thick stew. Every cook had a secret, a bit of fierce garlic, chopped onion, or a splash of black coffee. Others trusted nothing but meat, beans, and steady coals. The dish was more than food. It cured exhaustion, fueled conversation, and worked as an advertisement in a bowl. Plenty of joints promised a bowl of red that brings your bite back, with sourdough on the side or eaten straight from the spoon, warming the bones of anyone who wasn't afraid of heat. 22. Bread pudding with whiskey sauce. In the dusty saloons of the West, not every cowboy remembered to order dessert, but the ones who did knew exactly what to look for: a steaming bread pudding. It was born from whatever was left over from the day: chunks of bread, tired biscuits, or forgotten cornbread, all soaked in milk, sweetened with beaten eggs. The dish went into the oven and came back golden, sending waves of cinnamon and spice across the whole room. Some cooks stirred in raisins or dried apples, which softened and burst with flavor in every bite. The more generous ones whipped up a hot whiskey sauce with butter and sugar, poured over the top at the last minute, turning that simple dessert into a quiet invitation to rest for anyone who'd spent days on horseback, and making plenty of men linger just to wait for that pan to show up on the bar. 23. Cornmeal-crusted fried trout. In towns wedged into the mountains where the rivers ran cold and clear, saloon life was mostly the same: tough meat, thin beans, tired silence. Everything changed when someone walked in with trout shining at the bottom of a bucket. Right there, the fish were cleaned, dredged in coarse cornmeal mixed with salt and pepper, and dropped into hot fat that crackled non-stop. The firm crust hid tender meat, served whole on tin plates with potatoes or pickled onions, a sight that impressed travelers from back east looking for comfort. For the cowboy who'd spent weeks on basic rations, that trout caught in the morning and eaten at sundown felt like a small luxury, and the smell drifting through the room pulled everyone closer to the bar, as if, for a moment, the desert outside had lost some of its weight. 24. Gooseberry cobbler. In the Old West, a lot of folks recognized gooseberry cobbler just from the smell drifting out of the saloon kitchen. The little wild gooseberries, picked on slopes and in clearings, went into a pot with sugar until they turned into a thick filling, almost like firm jam. Then that mixture was poured into heavy cast-iron pans and topped with spoonfuls of dough that browned in the wood-fired oven. Some saloons served it with a splash of cream, others with just a dusting of sugar. Every bite mixed tartness, sweetness, and childhood memories, helping cowboys forget trail dust and letting old-timers relive harvest seasons. For many, it was less a dessert and more a piece of home traveling with them across the territory. 25. Scrapple. Brought from mid-Atlantic kitchens to the rough tables of the Old West, scrapple came straight from Pennsylvania Dutch tradition to the breakfast plates of cowboys and travelers. Pork scraps were cooked with cornmeal and spices until they turned into a firm mush, poured into molds, cooled into blocks, sliced thick, and thrown onto a smoking hot griddle. The outside browned and crackled, the center stayed soft, ready to go alongside strong coffee, eggs, and talk before hitting the road. Cheap and easy to make on simple stoves, it kept the crew moving and turned thrift into a daily habit. For newcomers, that mix of odds and ends from the pig might have seemed strange. For them, it was just plain common sense, served in crispy slices and drizzled with molasses, mustard, or whatever happened to be on hand. Back in Old West times, saloons were more than just stages for brawls. They were a stopping point for anyone riding dry trails in search of work, gold, or just a place to breathe. Every stop came with a new smell drifting out of the kitchen. It was there, between stained glasses and low conversations, that the 25 recipes you just got to know were born. Some dishes kept cowboys awake, some were unlikely combos thrown together just to fool hunger, and some were so good they'd stick in the memory even today. If this ride made you hungry, hit like, subscribe, ring the bell, and tell me in the comments, which dish would you attack without fear, and which one would you let pass? And to keep this cattle drive going, click on the next video and check out more stories that time almost swallowed whole.